Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So let's play a game. Let's play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. So, Mrs. Hobert Flynn. Oh, and by the way, I have enlisted all of you as my co-conspirators. So you're going to help me legally get away with all of this. So, Mrs. Hobert Flynn, I want to run. If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
Okay, so there's nothing stopping me from being entirely funded by corporate PACs, say from the fossil fuel industry, the healthcare industry, big pharma. I'm entirely 100% lobbyist PAC funded. Okay, so let's say I'm a really, really bad guy, and let's say I have some skeletons in my closet that I need to cover up so that I can get elected. Mr. Smith, is it true that you wrote this article, this opinion piece for the Washington Post entitled, "These payments to women were unseemly, that doesn't mean they were illegal"?
Well, I can't see the piece, but I wrote a piece under that headline in the Post, so I assume that's right.
Okay, great. So, green light for hush money. I can do all sorts of terrible things. It's totally legal right now for me to pay people off. And that is considered speech. That money is considered speech. So I use my special interest dark money funded campaign to pay off folks that I need to pay off and get elected. So now I'm elected, now I'm in. I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Fabulous. Now, is there any hard limit that I have? Perhaps Mrs. Hobert Flynn, is there any hard limit that I have in terms of what legislation I'm allowed to touch? Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence, especially if I'm based on the special interest funds that I accepted to finance my campaign and get me elected in the first place?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by oil and gas. I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Okay, so awesome. Now, Mr. Mehrbani, the last thing I want to do is get rich with as little work possible. That's really what I'm trying to do as the bad guy, right? So is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and cause, that could potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that.
So I could do that. I could do that now with the way our current laws are set up. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so my last question is, or one of my last questions, I guess I'd say, is it possible that any elements of this story apply to our current government and our current public servants right now?
Yes.
Yes.
So we have a system that is fundamentally broken. We have these influences existing in this body, which means that these influences are here in this committee shaping the questions that are being asked of you all right now. Would you say that that's correct,
Yes.
Mr. Mehrbani or Mr. Shaub?
Yes.
All right, so one last thing, Mr. Shaub. In relation to congressional oversight that we have, the limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability? Is there more teeth in that regulation in Congress on the President, or would you say it's about even, or more so on the federal?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Roy of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Smith, I wondered if you might have any comments on the questioning by my colleague from New York. You seem to have a few notes you're writing down. Anything you want to say after that discussion?
Well, I would say there are a couple things, for example, that would not be. She answers, is there anything that could apply here? There are certain things that could not apply here. For example, the whole point of the article that she held up that I wrote was that you cannot use your campaign funds to make those kinds of payments. That would be illegal personal use.
Right.
Campaign funds are not dark money. They are totally disclosed, so they are not dark money. It's worth noting, by the way, that earlier it was mentioned that dark money constituted about $1.7 billion. I believe that figure is incorrect by a factor of about 500%. Dark money constitutes about 2 to 4% of the total spending in U.S. elections and has always been involved in U.S. elections. So those are just a couple of points. And I did kind of chuckle at the question, is it possible, asked of us, that these influences this money is influencing the questioning here? To that, I'd say that's something you have to ask yourselves if you're being influenced and see what you think. If you are, you might question yourselves. If you're not, you might question this hearing.
A couple of questions about super PACs, as they are often referred to. Are federal candidates allowed to coordinate directly with a super PAC and/or have anything to do legally with its formation?
No, they are not at the current time. No.
With respect to super PACs, is this a particularly partisan problem, or would you say both parties have super PACs funding elections and funding candidacies?
Both do, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on this. I believe historically they've leaned more Republican, but in the last election cycle leaned more Democratic. I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's certainly a bipartisan issue.
So if we deploy the famous "let me Google that for you," and we got this to come up to say, well, a bunch of headlines when you Google it to say, Democrat super PAC spending $3 million from Menendez in New Jersey, super PAC money dominated 2018 election in Colorado, and Democrats controlled in the cash race. Democratic super PAC translates ads to Spanish after seeing election day search trends. And if we went through and through and through, we would see that this is not a particularly partisan question or problem. It's just a baseline. Is that right, Mr. Smith?
I think that's right.
And when we think about what we're dealing with respect to campaign finance, are you familiar with doxing?
In the sense of outing people online, that's you're referring to, yes, generally.
So, for example, are you familiar with a Twitter account called Every Trump Donor?
No, I'm
which
not.
tweeted out one by one the names, hometowns, occupations, employers, of people who contributed as little as $200 to the president's campaign, each tweet following a particular formula. My point being, and the question for you is, when we talk about campaign disclosures, are we aware of the negative impacts that you have on forcing American citizens in exercising their free speech to have that information be disclosed? Whether that's good policy or not might be debatable, but are there negative consequences to that with respect to free speech, given you're an expert on free speech?
There are definitely studies that have shown that disclosure does tend to decrease participation. Now, that doesn't mean, as you point out, that it's not worth it, but it certainly has cost. And so we have to be careful in how broad we let that disclosure become.
Thank you. Mrs. Hobert Flynn, just a quick question. Did I hear correctly earlier in one of your exchanges with one of my colleagues here that you consider proof of citizenship as one of the barriers to voting or one of the obstacles for people to be able to vote, a proof of citizenship? Is that one of the ones you outlined?
Yes, that it's appeared, it is used, at many polling places that people just attest to that. To have to come up with the paperwork is a burden for many Americans.
As well as you outlined photo ID, early voting changes, if you're restricting early voting from being longer, shorter, and election day registration. That's the position. And the reason I ask is because when we look at obstacles to voting, we know that the Voting Rights Act was a paramount piece of legislation to ensure people have access to the polls. We also know that the Voting Rights Act ran into constitutional problems in Shelby County versus Holder for very good reason. If you look at what the majority wrote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem. In the face of unremitting and ingenious defiance of citizens' constitutionally protected right to vote, Section 5 was necessary to give effect to the 15th Amendment in particular regions of the country. This is South Carolina v. Katzenbach. And today, this is now Justice Thomas writing in a concurrence, today our nation has changed. The conditions that originally justified Section 5 are no longer characterized voting in the covered jurisdictions. Mr. Smith, are you aware that in this legislation, there's an attempt to bring Section 5 back with respect to preclearance? And could you comment at all on that and what that might mean?
As we're out of time, I'll just note that, yes, that is true. And I think the Supreme Court's concern was that the formula applied from data from 1964 and simply needed to be updated to reflect modern realities. And this bill, I don't believe, makes any effort to do that.
That is correct. Thank you.
Congresswoman Pressley of Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very interesting hearing. Charges of radicalism, accusations of motives of partisanship, but never a peep or outrage about partisan gerrymandering, which has benefited your party for decades. That is really convenient and rich and hypocritical. H.R. 1 has been described as a wish list by the Democrats. Well, you've got us there. A wish list for an inclusive, expanded democracy and electorate. Characterizations of H.R. 1 as a power grab. You got us again, guilty. We wouldn't have to grab back the power for the people if through policy you weren't complicit in or perpetuating the disenfranchisement and marginalization of the people, and disproportionately people of color, and disproportionately Black people. Representative John Lewis reminds us that if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't work so hard to take it from you. This is the House of Representatives. We are sent here as representatives of our districts and a greater democracy. And at the core of democracy and the root word of demos is to engage more voices, and to empower them in this democracy. I am really at a loss for words. I am embarrassed and hurt by the dog whistles, by the vitriol and the venom in this space, and the smugness. It is stunning and unconscionable. Disappointment and outrage about a federal holiday for Election Day, early voting and mail-in voting, the rights of formerly incarcerated restored. According to the Sentencing Project, 6.1 million Americans have lost their right to vote due to felony disenfranchisement laws that disproportionately impact communities of color. Ms. Flynn, the United States ranks 26 among the lowest of all established democracies around the world in voter turnout. Certainly belies characterizations of American exceptionalism. Could you speak to the passage of H.R. 1 and the establishment of a federal voting holiday, how this would help to broaden turnout, particularly for voters who have historically been disenfranchised? Could you also speak to how many developed countries follow this practice and how it has impacted their turnout?
Yes, I apologize, I do not have information, but I will share it with the committee about other countries. But I will say that a federal holiday can make a huge difference for many Americans who cannot afford to take a day off of work to get to the polls, or as we have seen, Common Cause and the Lawyers Committee and many other voting rights groups do election protection during the election season. And we saw long lines in states across the country. We had machines that were breaking down or switching votes. We had machines that did not work, and so people had long lines. Many people cannot afford to wait in line for 3, 4, 5 hours at a polling place, many have to get back to work. So a federal holiday would make a big difference.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amy, so we've spoken a great deal about lobbying corruption. I'd like to speak about the corruption of contractors. Mr. Amy, in your written testimony, you discussed the crisis of the rampant revolving door, where ranking officials commonly enter cushy jobs for the very contractors they were charged with overseeing on behalf of taxpayers. Last year, your organization issued an investigative report that Tracy Valero, a former senior official for ICE, less than 3 months after leaving government service, she was hired by the GEO Group, ICE's largest single private prison and detention center, which brought in more than $327 million in the last year alone. She even served as an expert witness for the company in a lawsuit that alleged violations of minimum wage laws and other inhumane treatment of immigrant detainees. Mr. Amy, in your expert opinion, is it ethical for a senior government contracting office to go work for the very entity she was overseeing just months before?
The quick answer is no. And that's where the law is created that has cooling off periods. And so there's no cooling off period, a 1 year, a 2 year, or permanent bans. H.R. 1 would move a lot of those to 2 years, I think, which would be beneficial. And there's even disagreement in our community whether 1 year or 2, what is the appropriate time to kind of cool off so that your contacts aren't there. But this is also something that President Trump brought up. When he was a candidate, he talked about, I think it was Boeing at the time, but he went on record saying that people who give contracts should never be able to work for that defense contractor. This is a bipartisan issue. This is something we can resolve. The laws are already on the books. We just need some extensions and some tweaking of those to improve them and allow people to cool off and not be able to provide a competitive advantage to their new employer or favor them as they're in office and they're walking out the door.
And so you do believe that extending this cooling off period and strengthening these prohibitions would protect the integrity of the process and help to rein in these flagrant abuses? 100%.
And one of the nice things with H.R. 1 is there is an extension of a cooling off period for people coming into government service. Currently it exists and it's 1 year. This will move it to 2. And I think that's a probably better place to be, that you shouldn't be handling issues that involve your former employer or clients.
One final question. How might these cozy relationships between government officials and corporate leaders or private contractors help to boost profits for these prison and detention centers?
Well, certainly they go with a lot of information when they go over to the private sector, but it also allows them to get back into their former office and within their former agency and call on them. Access, as you were just pointing out, access is everything in this town. And so if you can get your phone calls answered, if you can get emails read, if you get meetings, at that point that can, not only with members of Congress, but with agency heads, that can determine who gets contracts. I mean, it does trickle down from the top, and we need to make sure that we prevent as many like actual and also appearances of conflicts of interest we can.
Thank you so much. I yield.